Hello, my name is Alexander Lopez, and welcome to my Pixar project. The movie that inspired this was, of course, the movie Brave. My question is, how does Disney and Pixar's Brave depict the five stages of grief, and how does it affect us? Well, in order to ask this question, we must know what the five stages of grief are. This is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she is the person who created the five stages of grief, or at least created the idea of the five stages of grief. She believes that when a person is grieving, they go through five stages. Those five stages being denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. Now, my argument and problem comes from David Kessler. He was a co-author for another Elizabeth Kubler-Ross book called On Grief and Grieving. And David Kessler argues that no matter who you are or where you are in the world, that eventually everyone is going to go through the five stages of grief. However, he does continue on with this idea, claiming that someone might not start directly at denial. However, they can start at bargaining or depression or anger instead of going through the traditional five stages. Now, we're going to be seeing this through a gender perspective. So with this perspective, we're going to be seeing how men and women handle grief and emotions. So first of all, this is David P. Schmidt. He's a psychologist straight from the University of Michigan. And during his findings of an article titled, "Are Women More Emotional Than Men?" he finds out that through a group of researchers, women are more likely to tell if someone is in a state of grief simply because of their mother-like instincts. Neuroscientists have found out that women have something implemented in their minds to where their mother-like instincts come along and they can tell whether if a child is in need or in danger or just needs some love. These same researchers found out that when women are perceived with images of death, harm to animals and both humans, that they react very poorly to them. And that because of these poor reactions, that they are most likely to express these, whether if it's verbally or physically, as they conducted these experiments. On the contrary, though, this is Audrey Nelson. She's another psychologist and author of a proclaimed book titled Navigating Nonverbal Communications Between the Sexes. So obviously she has some insight of how men and women interact with one another. In her article, in one of her articles, she argues that social norms are the reasons why men are closed off and can't express their reasons all that well. In this article, she claims that it is a social taboo for men to cry and to show their emotions, and it's a sign of weakness when a man does show their softer sides. And Audrey Nelson shuns this. She believes that because of social norms, men can't fully express who they are, and because of these social norms pressured on men, that they can't show whether if they're grieving or they can't fully express their emotions. She furthers this claim saying that during elementary school, that in kindergarten, first grade, it's alright to carry a stuffed animal or carry something that keeps you safe from fear. However, once you reach the second grade, men are indoctrinated to believe that once you show fear and emotions, you are automatically seen as a quote-unquote sissy. So obviously we can see that there's an inequality between men and women when they are expressing their emotions or when they're going through grief. Now, I want to take this from a gender perspective to a nationality perspective. So this is going to be seeing how countries handle grief and loss differently and how nationality plays a factor into one's grief. This is author and former CEO of a company, John Chuckman, and he argues that Americans deal loss and death as a tragedy. That Americans don't take death all that lightly. And when there is a death, their mourning, or as they mourn, it is publicized on such a large scale that it shouldn't be right to be seen as death as a tragedy, rather as a way of life, and that we're all going to face it at least one point or another. So, because of these findings and because of these examples from media and books and television and music, John Chuckman obviously thinks and argues that America doesn't deal with loss and death all that well. So, clearly, nationality does play a part into one's grief when there is one, when there is a loss. Now, I wanted to do a comparison between two North American countries because I thought it'd be kind of different how one nation underneath another nation can see death differently. And obviously, Mexico handles death and loss completely different than their northern counterparts. A prime example of this is, of course, the Day of the Dead. A 2-day holiday where people come together and they respect the dead and respect loved ones that have passed. Obviously, that is a contrasting tone between the tragic and the loss and disaster of death that the connotation that Americans have, rather Mexicans have. And I found that quite different. I found that quite astounding because even though they're both Northern American countries and they're pretty close together, they still have very different viewpoints on death. So because of these reasons, I have found out that the best way that these factors, whether if it's gender or nationality, they do play an important role in our grieving and in our emotions. So obviously with men, it is a bit harder for males to communicate about their emotions differently rather than women, where it's kind of more socially acceptable for women to express their feelings rather than men, as Audrey Nelson explained how it is seen by social norms that men shouldn't be able to perceive their emotions or show them at all. And nationality does play a big part in whether you see death or loss as a way of life or as tragic and something that we should all shun upon, even though that is something we're eventually going to see in our lifetime. So to answer to answer David Kessler's question, whether or not all of us are going to eventually face grief, and if there's other key factors that play into grief, of course there is. The two main ones being gender and nationality.